There are certain kinds of wisdom that age never dulls, certain kinds of truth that no century can make irrelevant, and certain kinds of voices that, once you truly hear them, stay with you for the rest of your life. Booker T. Washington was one of those voices. He was a man who was born into slavery, who had nothing, who owned nothing, who had no last name and no legal right to his own body, and yet he built one of the most important educational institutions in American history, shaped the minds of thousands of young people, and left behind a collection of talks so full of practical, real, lived wisdom that reading them today still feels like someone placed a warm hand on your shoulder and told you exactly what you needed to hear. This is not a story about a perfect man. This is not a summary of theories cooked up in some comfortable library by someone who never struggled. This is something far more valuable than that. Character building is a collection of Sunday evening talks that Booker T. Washington gave to the students at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, beginning in the late 1800s and continuing into the early years of the 20th century. These were not polished speeches written for a grand audience. They were conversations, real ones. He stood in front of young men and young women who had walked miles to attend his school, who had come from poverty and hardship and uncertainty, and he talked to them the way a father talks to children he loves and believes in. He talked about how to live, how to work, how to be honest, how to handle failure, how to treat other people, how to build something that lasts. And here is what makes this book extraordinary. Every single thing he said still applies. Every single word still fits. Not because the world has not changed, because it has changed enormously, but because the things Washington was talking about were never about a particular time or place. He was talking about human nature. He was talking about what it actually takes to become the kind of person the world needs, and the kind of person you yourself can be proud of. And that does not change. It has never changed. It will not change. So let us walk through this together. Let us take what Washington gave those students at Tuskegee and bring it all the way forward to here, to now, to you. Because everything he said matters, and it matters personally, and it matters deeply. Washington understood something that a lot of people in his time did not want to acknowledge, and honestly, a lot of people today still resist. He understood that character is not something you are born with. It is not something handed to you. It is not something that appears one day because you decided you wanted it. Character is built, slowly and carefully and sometimes painfully, through the choices you make every single day when nobody is watching, when there is no reward, when there is no applause, and when the easier choice is sitting right there in front of you looking extremely attractive. He used to tell his students a story, or rather, he used to point to a truth he had seen play out over and over again in real life. He would say that the people who failed, really failed, not just temporarily fell down but genuinely collapsed and never recovered, were almost never people who lacked intelligence. They were almost never people who lacked talent. What they lacked was the slow, unglamorous, invisible infrastructure of good character. They lacked the habits. They lacked the discipline. They lacked the willingness to be honest even when honesty was costly, to do the work even when no one was watching, to keep their word even when breaking it would have been easy and profitable. Think about that for a moment. Really sit with it. How many times have you seen someone brilliant fall apart? How many times have you watched someone with every apparent advantage destroy everything they built? And how many times, if you looked closely, did it come down not to bad luck or unfair circumstances, but to something much quieter and much more internal? A habit of cutting corners, a tendency to lie when lying felt convenient, a pattern of blaming others when things went wrong, a slow, gradual drift away from the values they claimed to hold. Washington saw this constantly. He was running a school full of young people who were starting with almost nothing, and his deepest concern was not just whether they could learn a trade or pass an examination. His deepest concern was whether they were building the internal structure, the genuine character, that would allow everything else they built to actually stand. He talked about cleanliness, and this might surprise you, because when we think about great moral and philosophical thinkers, we don't usually think about a man standing in front of students telling them to wash their hands and keep their rooms tidy. But Washington was not separating the small from the large. He understood that how you do anything is how you do everything. The student who kept their dormitory room in careless disorder was practicing a habit. They were practicing the habit of accepting things as less than they could be, of tolerating disorder, of choosing comfort over care. And that habit, so small, so seemingly trivial, would show up again and again in every other area of their life. In how they did their work, in how they kept their promises, in how they treated other people. He once walked into a student's room and found it in complete disorder. He did not shout. He did not lecture. He simply said quietly and seriously that this room tells me something about how you think about yourself and about your future. He believed, completely and without reservation, that the way you maintain your physical environment is a direct expression of the way you maintain your internal environment. And the reverse is equally true. If you want to begin building better internal habits, you begin with the physical. You begin with what you can see and touch. You make your bed, you clean your space, you take care of the things around you. And in doing that, you are practicing something. You are practicing a way of being in the world that says, I take things seriously. I respect the life I have been given. I am not waiting for something grand to arrive before I begin being a person of quality. There is a young man, let's call him Marcus, who grew up in a difficult neighborhood, whose school was underfunded, whose home was chaotic, and who arrived at a community college at 18 with almost no idea how to study or how to organize his life. He was smart. Everyone who knew him could see that. But his notebooks were a mess. His assignments were late. His room in the dormitory looked like a small hurricane had taken up permanent residence. His grades reflected all of this. And then one professor, an older man who had clearly been paying attention, pulled him aside one afternoon and said something that changed everything. He said, Marcus, the way you treat your notebook is the way you are currently treating your future. If you want a different future, start with the notebook. Marcus laughed, at first, but something in it stayed with him. That night he cleaned his room, not because he suddenly had some grand transformation of the soul, but because it was something he could do, something small and concrete and entirely within his control. And then he organized his notebook, and then he started arriving to class 5 minutes early instead of 5 minutes late. Each small thing was practice. Each small thing was a vote for the kind of person he was choosing to become. By the end of that year, his grades had improved substantially. By the end of 2 years, he had transferred to a 4-year university. Not because he had become a different person in some mystical overnight transformation, but because he had spent 2 years making thousands of small choices that slowly, steadily added up to someone with genuine habits of care and discipline. That is what Washington was talking about. That is precisely what he was trying to give those students at Tuskegee. Not a philosophy, not a theory, a practice. A daily, hourly, moment-to-moment practice of choosing to do the small things well, because the small things are never actually small. Washington also spoke with remarkable honesty and depth about the subject of work. Not work as a concept, not work as a virtue to be admired from a distance, but work as the actual daily physical and mental engagement with what needs to be done. He believed, with great passion and great certainty, that there was dignity in every form of honest labor. This was not a casual belief. This was a belief forged in the fire of his own biography. He had grown up during slavery. As a child, he had worked. After emancipation, he had continued to work, doing whatever needed to be done to survive and to learn. He had walked hundreds of miles to attend school. He had worked as a janitor to pay for his education. He had done things that many people would have considered beneath them, and he had done them not just willingly, but with genuine commitment and care, because he understood something fundamental about labor that gets lost in a culture that celebrates only glamorous achievement. He understood that how you work tells the world, and more importantly, tells yourself exactly who you are. He was deeply troubled by the tendency he saw in some educated people, particularly people who had recently gained access to education after being denied it for generations, to look down on physical labor. He understood where this came from. If slavery had meant manual labor, then freedom might naturally come to feel like freedom from manual labor. But Washington saw this as a profound and dangerous confusion. He saw it as confusing the circumstances of oppression with the nature of work itself. Work is not oppression. Work is human. Work is how we engage with the world. Work is, in fact, one of the primary ways we develop character, because real work requires patience, attention, precision, persistence, and care. And all of those are things that make us better not just at our jobs but at living. He told his students, in various ways and at various times, that the man who digs a ditch well is more admirable than the man who writes a speech poorly. Not because ditch digging is superior to speech writing, but because excellence, genuine engaged excellent effort, is always more valuable than careless performance of something prestigious. The quality of the effort matters more than the prestige of the task. Think about what this means in practice. Think about the person who takes every job they have ever had, no matter how entry-level, no matter how temporary, no matter how unglamorous, and does that job with complete commitment and genuine care. Think about what that person learns. They learn reliability. They learn how to show up. They learn how to get things done under imperfect conditions. They learn how to deal with difficult colleagues and demanding bosses and boring repetitive tasks. They learn, slowly and through direct experience, what it actually feels like to do something well. And all of that learning becomes part of who they are. It becomes part of their character. It becomes a resource they can draw on for the rest of their lives. Now think about the person who does every job carelessly, who gets through it rather than into it, who is always half present and half somewhere else, who is always waiting for the real opportunity, the real work, the real moment when they will finally apply themselves. That person is also learning, but they are learning the wrong things. They are learning that it is acceptable to give less than your best. They are practicing the habit of disengagement. They are building a character structured around the comfortable avoidance of genuine effort. Washington saw both kinds of students at Tuskegee, and he cared about them all, but he worried most about the second kind, because the second kind often did not realize what was happening to them. They were not being dramatic or rebellious. They were just slowly, unconsciously, day by day, building a character that would eventually make it very hard to succeed at anything that mattered. He spoke about this in terms of habits. And the psychology of it is fascinating. A habit is not just a repeated behavior. A habit is a groove in your brain, a neural pathway that gets deeper and more automatic every time you travel it. Every time you do something, you make it slightly easier to do that thing again. Every time you make your bed, you make it slightly easier to make your bed tomorrow. Every time you do the difficult task instead of avoiding it, you make it slightly easier to choose difficulty over avoidance next time. And every time you do the reverse, you make that slightly easier too. This means that every single day, you are either building yourself up or wearing yourself down. And you are doing it through these small, apparently inconsequential choices that seem like nothing in isolation, but are everything in accumulation. Washington understood this with a clarity that was well ahead of his time, and he talked about it not in the language of neuroscience, which did not yet exist as we know it, but in the language of character and habit and practice, which are, it turns out, just older words for the same truth. He had particular things to say about honesty, and these things are worth dwelling on because Washington did not treat honesty as simply a moral rule, as a commandment to follow. He treated it as a practical necessity. He treated it as the foundation upon which everything else rests. And he had seen, with his own eyes, what happened when that foundation was absent. He talked about how a reputation for honesty is one of the most valuable things a person can possess, and how a reputation for dishonesty is one of the most devastating handicaps a person can carry. Not just in the obvious ways, not just in the sense that liars get caught and punished, but in subtler and deeper ways. When you are dishonest, even in small things, even in ways no one else ever discovers, you carry the knowledge of it, and that knowledge does something to you. It makes you uncertain about yourself. It makes you slightly less confident in your own judgments and decisions, because some part of you knows that you are a person who, when things get difficult, sometimes chooses the comfortable lie over the uncomfortable truth. And that slight erosion of self-trust compounds over time into something that can become genuinely crippling. He also talked about the way dishonesty, even small dishonesty, damages relationships in ways that are hard to repair. He told his students about the experience of working with someone who had told a small lie, something trivial, easily rationalized, probably forgotten by the teller within a week. But the person who had been lied to did not forget. They could not entirely trust anymore. Every interaction from that point forward had a slight shadow over it, a slight qualification, a slight holding back. And that shadow, That qualification, that holding back, was the cost of the small lie. It was the invisible tax that kept being paid long after the original transaction had been forgotten. Washington asked his students to imagine building a reputation. Think of it, he said, as building a wall. Every honest action, every kept promise, every time you told the truth when a lie would have been easier, is a brick in that wall. Every dishonest action, every broken promise, every convenient lie is not just a missing brick, but a brick removed. And a wall with bricks removed does not fail gracefully. It stands, and then, at some unexpected moment, when the load upon it reaches a certain threshold, it falls entirely. He had seen men and women of apparently solid reputation collapse suddenly and completely because the inner structure of their honesty had been quietly compromised over years of small, dishonest choices. And he had seen people of modest circumstances and modest abilities rise steadily and surely because everyone who worked with them, everyone who depended on them, everyone who had ever given them a chance, had found them to be exactly what they presented themselves to be. Reliable, honest, true. There is a woman, let us call her Diane, who worked in a small accounting office for the first 15 years of her career. She was not the most brilliant person in her field. She did not have the most impressive credentials, but she had one quality that everyone who worked with her noticed and remembered. She never, ever pretended to know something she did not know. In a field and in a culture where everyone was always performing competence and confidence, where admitting uncertainty was widely considered a career risk, Diane simply said what she knew, said what she did not know, and said what she was going to do to find out. It felt radical. It felt to some of her colleagues almost naive, but over 15 years it built something extraordinary. She built a reputation as the person whose word was absolutely reliable, whose assessments could be trusted completely, whose admission of uncertainty was worth more than most people's confident assertions. By the time she was in her mid-40s, she was being sought out by organizations for her judgment in ways that had nothing to do with her technical skills and everything to do with the character she had built through 15 years of small, honest choices. That is what Washington was talking about. That is exactly the wall he was describing. Washington spoke frequently about the relationship between work and learning, and this is a thread that runs through everything in character building. He was running an institution that deliberately combined academic study with practical work, where students learned carpentry and bricklaying and farming alongside reading and mathematics and history, and he had thought very deeply about why this combination was not a compromise but was, in fact, a superior form of education. He believed, and he argued this at length and with great passion, that the separation of head and hand, the divorce of intellectual work from physical work, produced a distorted kind of person. Someone with knowledge that had never been tested by reality, someone with ideas that had never been disciplined by the demands of actual execution. He had seen the results of purely theoretical education in students who could describe the principles of agriculture, but had never grown anything, who could discuss the theory of construction, but had never built anything, who had learned to think about the world without learning to engage with it. And he found this profoundly incomplete. But he was equally troubled by the opposite distortion, by a purely practical education that trained the hands without engaging the mind, that produced skilled workers who could not think critically about their work, could not imagine doing it differently, could not solve problems they had not seen before. He wanted both. He wanted students who could think and do, who could imagine and execute, who could understand the theory behind the practice and feel, in their hands and bodies, what the theory actually meant. This is genuinely radical thinking, and not just for his time. We still struggle with it. We still tend to divide people into thinkers and doers, into those who went to university and those who learned a trade, as if these were mutually exclusive categories, as if the person who can think deeply and work skillfully with their hands is somehow unusual or exceptional, rather than the obvious ideal. Washington was insisting that the obvious ideal was what he was trying to produce. Every student at Tuskegee was expected to engage with both dimensions of human capability. And the result, he believed, and the results seemed to confirm, was people with a much more solid and integrated sense of themselves, people who knew what they could do, who had been tested by real work and real difficulty, who had discovered through experience rather than theory what they were capable of. He talked about this in terms of self-knowledge, which he considered absolutely essential to genuine character. You cannot really know what you stand for until you have been tested. You cannot know what you value until you have had to choose between your values and your comfort. You cannot know what kind of worker you are until you have worked. You cannot know what kind of leader you are until you have had to lead through difficulty. And all of this knowledge, this tested, experiential self-knowledge, is fundamentally different from the ideas you have about yourself when nothing has yet challenged them. This is something that every generation rediscovers in its own way, often painfully. Young people who have been told they are exceptional arrive in the world and discover that the world does not yet know this. They have to prove it, not once, not dramatically, but consistently, through sustained performance under real conditions. And the ones who have already learned to work, who have already been tested by genuine difficulty, who already know what it feels like to push through resistance rather than avoid it, have an enormous advantage. Not because they are smarter or more talented, but because they already know themselves better. They already have evidence about who they are when things are hard. Washington told his students, in various ways across many talks, that he wanted Tuskegee to be a place where they gathered that evidence, where the difficulty was not removed, but was present and real, so that they could discover, in a relatively safe and supported environment, what they were actually made of. And then, when they left and went out into a world that would be less safe and less supportive, they would go as people who already knew, already tested, already, in the most real sense, prepared. He had a great deal to say about the specific quality of patience, and this is something I want to spend some time on because it seems to me one of the most important and most undervalued things in his whole body of work. Washington was a patient man, not passively patient, not the patient of someone waiting for others to solve their problems, but actively, strategically, persistently patient in the way that only someone with a very long view and very clear goals can be. He had been born into slavery. He had watched emancipation arrive, and then watched the brutal disappointments and reversals of Reconstruction. He had seen the promises of freedom qualified and limited, and in many places effectively withdrawn. He lived and worked in a time of profound and vicious racial injustice, and he was building an institution in the middle of Alabama in the 1880s and 1890s and 1900s, and he understood with crystalline clarity that nothing he was building could be built quickly. Nothing worth building ever is. He talked to his students about the difference between two kinds of ambition. One kind is in a hurry. It wants the result now, wants the recognition now, wants the reward before the work is done. This kind of ambition is actually a kind of impatience, and impatience, Washington believed, is one of the great destroyers of potential. Because the things worth building, the things worth becoming, do not happen quickly. They happen through sustained, patient, persistent effort over long periods of time. And the person who cannot sustain that effort, who needs the gratification to come faster than it actually comes, will keep stopping and starting, will keep abandoning good projects just before they would have succeeded, will keep making the mistake of interpreting slowness as failure and quitting before the real results appear. The second kind of ambition is ambitious about the work itself, about doing it better, about mastering it more completely, about understanding it more deeply. This kind of ambition is actually a kind of love, a love of the thing being pursued. And this kind of ambition can be patient because it is being rewarded all along the way, not by external recognition, but by the internal satisfaction of genuine engagement with something worth doing. Washington embodied the second kind of ambition in everything he did. He was extraordinarily ambitious about the quality of Tuskegee, about the quality of his students' education, about the quality of his own work and thinking. But he was never in a hurry for recognition or reward. He was willing to wait because he knew what he was building and he trusted the process of building it. He told his students, "You will not always see the results of what you are doing while you are doing it. You will plant seeds and not see them grow. You will make efforts and not see immediate outcomes. You will do the right thing and not immediately see it rewarded. And this is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. This is just the nature of anything worth doing. The results are real, but they are delayed. The harvest comes, but not immediately after the planting. Be patient, be consistent, trust the process. The evidence for this is everywhere, if you are willing to look. Let me tell you about a man, a real kind of man, whose story fits perfectly here. He spent 20 years working on a research project that almost everyone in his field told him was a dead end. He was not famous. He was not celebrated. He was not making money from it. Year after year, he showed up, did the work, refined his understanding, revised his approach, dealt with failure after failure. His colleagues moved on to more fashionable questions. His institution gave him less and less support. There were years when he genuinely questioned whether he was wasting his life. He was not. The breakthrough came in the 21st year. Not the kind of dramatic overnight breakthrough that makes for a nice movie, but the kind of quiet, accumulated breakthrough that comes when you have been genuinely paying attention to something for 2 decades, when you have made every mistake and learned from every one of them, when the knowledge you have built is both wide and deep enough to suddenly see the connection that was invisible before. The result of his work was genuinely significant. It changed how people in his field thought about a fundamental question. But here is the thing Washington would have noticed. The 21-year version of this man was only possible because of the 20 years of patient, unpraised, unrewarded, unglamorous effort. You cannot shortcut to that kind of knowledge. You cannot arrive at that kind of understanding by any route other than the slow one. The patience was not a sacrifice. The patience was the method. Washington returned again and again to the subject of how his students presented themselves to the world. And I want to be careful here because this is a subject that can easily be misunderstood. He was not talking about vanity or performance or putting on airs. He was talking about something much more serious and much more practical. He told his students that the first impression you make on anyone, the initial judgment they form of you before they have had a chance to know you properly, is made largely on the basis of how you appear and how you carry yourself. This is not fair. It is not how the world should work if we were designing it from scratch, but it is how the world does work, and Washington was a deeply practical man who was far more interested in what was true than in what was theoretically ideal. He wanted his students to understand that when they walked into a room, when they met a potential employer or a potential collaborator, or simply a stranger who might one day be important in their life, they were communicating something before they had said a single word. The cleanliness of their clothes communicated something. The way they held their posture communicated something. The steadiness with which they met another person's eyes communicated something. The care with which they spoke communicated something. None of these things were the substance of their character, but all of them were signals of the substance of their character. And those signals were what most people used to form their initial judgments. He was particularly concerned about this because he knew that his students, young black men and women in the American South at the turn of the 20th century, were already operating under enormous disadvantages. They were encountering a world that was, in many cases, actively hostile, that was looking for reasons to dismiss and discount them, that had often already decided what to think of them before they arrived. And in that environment, everything that was within their control mattered more, not less. Every signal of competence and dignity and care that they could send was worth sending. Not because they owed the world a performance, but because they owed themselves the best possible chance. He talked about the voice. He talked about how people speak, not just what they say, but how they say it. He encouraged his students to speak clearly, to speak with care, to choose their words thoughtfully, to avoid the careless speech that signals careless thinking. He talked about the power of saying less and meaning more, about the authority that comes from someone who speaks only when they have something worth saying, and then says it precisely and clearly and without unnecessary decoration. He talked about punctuality. He talked about it not as a courtesy but as a statement about who you are. When you are late, he told his students, you are telling the person who is waiting for you something. You are telling them that your time is more important than theirs. You are telling them that your convenience matters more than your word. And even if they say nothing, even if they forgive you graciously, they remember. They remember in the way we all remember things that tell us who someone really is, below the surface of what they claim to be. And he talked about follow-through, about what happens after you make a commitment. This, he believed, was perhaps the single clearest indicator of character, because making commitments is easy and everyone does it. But following through on commitments when it is difficult, when circumstances have changed, when the cost has turned out to be higher than you expected, that is where character reveals itself. He told his students that a person who does what they said they would do, even when it is hard, is a person who is building something real, and a person who makes commitments lightly, who adjusts their promises to fit their convenience, is a person who is slowly but surely building nothing. Now we are somewhere around the 10-minute mark of this journey, and if you have been listening, really listening, you might be starting to feel something. Not just intellectually engaged, but personally moved. Because what Washington was doing in these talks was not just giving advice to a particular group of students in a particular historical moment. He was describing something universal, something that lives in the part of being human that does not change across centuries or cultures or circumstances. He was describing the process by which a person, any person, builds a life that they can be proud of. And if you are finding this valuable, if this is the kind of thinking that makes you want to pause and reflect, and perhaps change how you are approaching something in your own life, please take a moment and like this video and subscribe to Audiobook Library. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear this kind of wisdom, and it allows us to keep creating content like this. Your support makes a real difference. Now let us continue, because there is so much more. Washington spoke with great feeling about the subject of gratitude and attitude, and he connected these in a way that I find both surprising and deeply true. He had noticed, and he spoke about this with a kind of directness that could only come from genuine concern, that many young people carry a kind of grievance, a chip on the shoulder, a low-level ongoing complaint about the unfairness of their circumstances. And he understood completely where this came from. He understood it from the inside, from his own experience. The unfairness was real. The injustice was real. The hardship was real. But he had also noticed something else. He had noticed that the people who carried that grievance most heavily, who were most focused on the unfairness of what had been done to them and what was being done to them, were almost never the people who were building anything significant. And the people who, without denying the unfairness, without pretending the injustice did not exist, managed to focus primarily on what they could do, what they could build, what they could become, these people were the ones who moved forward. These people were the ones who accomplished things. He was not asking his students to be naive or passive or accepting of things they should resist. He was asking them to understand something tactical and practical about the relationship between attention and outcome. Where you put your attention is where your energy goes. And if your attention is primarily on what has been taken from you, on what you have been denied, on the ways the world has been unfair, then your energy goes there. And that is energy that is not going toward building something. He talked about this in terms of what he called the spirit of the work. He believed that you could always tell when you watched someone work, whether their spirit was in it or whether it had been withdrawn, whether they were genuinely engaged or merely going through motions. And he believed that the spirit of the work was fundamentally connected to the attitude you brought to it, which was fundamentally connected to where your attention was living. The student who came to class thinking about how unfair it was that they had to be here, how much better their life might have been under different circumstances, how inadequate the resources were and how difficult the conditions, that student was not getting much out of the class. Not because the teacher was bad or the material was poor, but because their spirit had been withdrawn from the room. They were there in body and absent in every other sense. The student who came in present, who was genuinely curious, who was genuinely interested in what they might learn, who brought their full attention to bear on what was in front of them, that student got something real, something they could keep, something that became part of them. Washington told them that the world is full of people waiting for better circumstances before they fully engage, waiting for a better job before they start working hard, waiting for a better relationship before they start being fully present, waiting for more security before they start being generous. And the tragedy of this waiting, he said, is not just that the better circumstances often never come. The tragedy is that the waiting itself is what prevents the better circumstances from coming, because the better circumstances are built by the fully engaged effort that the waiting keeps deferring. This is such a profound and practical truth, and it applies to so many of us in ways we do not immediately recognize. Ask yourself honestly, is there an area of your life where you are currently waiting, where you have, consciously or unconsciously, decided to give less than your best until some condition is met, some situation improves, some change arrives? And is it possible, just possible, that the change you are waiting for is actually waiting for you. Washington talked about community, and this is another dimension of his thinking that I find extraordinarily rich. He cared deeply about the relationships between people, about the ways in which individual character development is both shaped by and shapes the community around it. He told his students that they were not just building themselves, they were building each other. He meant this very literally. He was running a school where students and teachers and administrators lived and worked together in close proximity, and he understood that every interaction in that environment was either building the community or eroding it. Every act of kindness, every moment of patience, every willingness to help a fellow student who was struggling, every time someone chose cooperation over competition, was adding something to the collective character of the institution. And every act of contempt, every piece of gossip, every instance of someone using another person's weakness against them was taking something away. He talked about gossip with particular intensity because he saw it as one of the most destructive forces in any community. He did not just mean malicious gossip, though that was certainly included. He meant the general habit of talking about people rather than talking to them, of building social currency out of other people's failures and misfortunes, of making yourself feel better or more interesting by making someone else look worse. He saw this as a profound moral failure, not dramatic but real, and a failure that did as much damage to the person practicing it as to the person being talked about. He told his students, "When you gossip, you are practicing a relationship with other human beings that is fundamentally exploitative. You are treating another person's private struggles as raw material for your own entertainment or social advancement. And you are building in yourself the habit of seeing other people that way, as material, as sources of entertainment, as opportunities to feel superior. And a person who has built that habit will find it increasingly difficult to have the genuine, vulnerable, honest relationships that are one of the great sources of joy and meaning in human life." He also talked about the flip side of this, about the extraordinary power of genuine encouragement. He had watched students transform under the influence of a teacher or a mentor or a friend who believed in them and said so, specifically and honestly. He had seen young people who had been told their whole lives that they were limited, that their potential was fixed and small, bloom almost overnight when someone they respected looked at them and said, "I see what you are capable of, and it is more than you know." He believed in this so completely that he made a practice of it himself. He was known for noticing things, small improvements, quiet efforts. The student who had been struggling and finally got something right. The student who had done something kind that no one else noticed. He noticed, and he said something, not extravagantly, not in a way designed to make people feel artificially good, but genuinely, specifically, accurately. "This person did this thing, and it was good, and I want them to know I saw it." Think about the people in your own life who have done this for you. Think about the moments when someone whose opinion you respected noticed something you did well and said so. How did that feel? How long did it last? How much did it matter to your sense of what you were capable of? Now think about how rarely most of us do this for the people around us. How much we think the good thing but don't say it. How often we notice an improvement but let it pass without acknowledgement. Washington was not talking about flattery. He was talking about accurate, honest recognition of genuine effort and genuine growth. And he believed that this kind of recognition, given freely and consistently and honestly, was one of the most powerful things one human being could offer another. He spoke at length about the subject of service, about what it means to live a life oriented towards something larger than your own comfort and success. This is not unusual territory for someone of his era and background. The language of service and obligation was common in the late 19th century, perhaps more common than it is now. But Washington's version of it was unusually specific and unusually free of sentimentality. He was not asking his students to sacrifice themselves. He was not calling for martyrdom or self-denial for its own sake. He was asking them to notice something that he had discovered through direct experience, that a life lived primarily in service of your own comfort and advancement is, in the end, a profoundly unsatisfying life. Not because it is morally wrong, though he might have argued that too, but because it does not work. It does not deliver what it promises. The person who is entirely focused on getting, on accumulating, on securing their own position and comfort, the person who approaches every relationship primarily in terms of what they can extract from it, who gives only when giving is personally advantageous, that person is, Washington believed, fundamentally impoverished. Not necessarily financially, but in the ways that matter more, in relationships, in meaning, in the sense of having contributed something real to the world. He told a story, or a parable, of a young man who came to him for advice about how to be successful, and Washington asked him what he meant by success. And the young man described things: money, position, respect, security, comfort. And Washington nodded and said, "Those are all fine things to want. But let me ask you something different. What is it that you are able to give? What is the particular thing that you can do, the particular problem you can solve, the particular need you can meet, that no one else can do as well as you?" The young man was confused. He had come asking about what he could get, and he was being asked about what he could give. But Washington pressed the point, because he believed it completely. He believed that the surest path to the things the young man wanted, the respect, the position, the security, was not through focusing on getting them, but through focusing on giving something genuinely valuable, through becoming the person whose particular gifts and capabilities solved problems and met needs that mattered to other people. This is not just idealism. This is also strategy. Think about the most genuinely successful people you know, not the people who merely have money, but the people who have built something real and lasting, and who are genuinely respected and genuinely satisfied with what they have built. Are they the people who are most focused on getting, or are they the people who are most focused on doing, on creating value, on solving problems, on being genuinely useful? Washington was insisting that these two things, doing real good work that genuinely serves others and building a successful life, are not in tension. They are the same thing. You build a successful life by doing genuinely valuable work in genuine service of something beyond yourself. And the reverse, the attempt to build a successful life by focusing primarily on extraction, by taking more than you give, by prioritizing your own comfort over genuine contribution, almost always ends in a strange and quiet failure even when it produces material accumulation. He talked about faith, not just religious faith, though that was certainly part of what he meant, but a broader faith in the meaning and value of the effort. A faith that the work mattered, that the investment of genuine care and genuine effort into genuine human beings produced real results, even when the results were slow to appear, even when the evidence was sometimes discouraging. He needed this faith. Running Tuskegee was an act of sustained faith. There were years when money was desperately short, years when the political environment was hostile, years when students arrived so underprepared and so damaged by their circumstances that the distance between where they were and where they needed to be seemed almost impossible to bridge. Washington did not pretend these difficulties away. He acknowledged them. He felt them. But he never lost the foundational belief that human beings are capable of extraordinary growth when given real support, real opportunity, and the genuine expectation that they will rise to meet it. He had a quote that appears in various forms throughout his talks, and it goes something like this: "Do not judge me by the heights I have reached, but by the depths from which I have come." He said this not as an excuse or a request for lowered standards, but as an insistence on proper accounting, a demand that progress be measured against starting points, not just against idealized endpoints. He was surrounded by students who had come from nothing, literally in many cases, nothing. No books, no stable homes, no teachers, no models of educational success anywhere in their backgrounds. And he was asking them to build something real, to develop genuine skills and genuine character, starting from that point. And he believed, and the evidence confirmed, that human beings starting from that point, given real support and real expectations and real work, could build something extraordinary. The faith required to hold that belief, to hold it against all the evidence that sometimes seemed to contradict it, against the students who failed, against the circumstances that kept conspiring to make everything harder. That faith was itself a kind of character, and Washington both possessed it and tried to teach it. Let us talk about failure. Washington talked about failure with a clarity and a lack of sentimentality that I find genuinely refreshing. He did not romanticize it. He did not pretend it was secretly a good thing in disguise. Failure, he acknowledged, is genuinely painful and genuinely costly. And the people who tell you it is nothing to worry about have usually not failed at something that really mattered to them. But he also refused to treat failure as something final, as a verdict, as a definition of who you were. He treated it as information, as feedback, as a very expensive, very unpleasant lesson in what needed to change. And his question, always his question, was not how do you avoid failure, or how do you feel about failure, but what do you do with it? He had failed, multiple times. He had tried things at Tuskegee that did not work. He had misjudged people and situations. He had started initiatives that had to be abandoned. He had made predictions that turned out to be wrong. And in each case, he had done what he counseled his students to do. He had looked at what happened without self-pity and without excessive self-criticism. He had asked what the failure told him. He had extracted the lesson. He had changed what needed to be changed. And he had moved forward. He was particularly concerned about the student who, after failing at something, simply stopped trying, who treated the failure as evidence that they did not have the capacity to succeed, rather than as evidence that they needed to try differently or try harder or try with better preparation. He saw this as one of the great tragedies of wasted human potential, and he worked very hard to interrupt it. He told his students about the nature of mastery. He had watched people become genuinely excellent at things, and he had noticed that the path from beginning to mastery almost always went through a period of failure. Not just mild difficulty, but genuine, humbling, discouraging failure. The beginner who has never failed at something has not yet begun to master it. Because mastery requires you to try things that are harder than you can currently do, and the inevitable result of consistently trying things that are harder than you can currently do is failure. Failure is not the opposite of mastery. Failure is the route to mastery. And the person who has understood this, who has genuinely internalized it, is free in a way that the person who fears failure is not. They can try difficult things. They can attempt ambitious goals. They can push beyond their current level without the paralyzing fear that failure will mean something about who they are. Because they know it will not. They know it will mean something much more useful, that they have not yet figured out this particular thing, but that they now know more about how to figure it out than they did before they tried. Washington had deep things to say about education itself, about what it is and what it is not, and these things feel particularly important now, in an era when the value and the meaning of formal education are being genuinely questioned by a lot of people in a lot of different ways. He never confused education with the possession of certificates or credentials. He had enormous respect for genuine learning, for the real development of a mind, for the genuine expansion of a person's capacity to understand and to act in the world. But he was deeply skeptical of the form without the substance, of the credential without the character, of the diploma without the genuine development that the diploma was supposed to represent. He had seen students come through Tuskegee who left technically qualified but not genuinely educated, who had acquired the technical knowledge without acquiring the deeper habits of thought and character that were the real point of the whole enterprise. And he regarded this as a serious failure, because those students had the appearance of preparation without the reality, which was in some ways worse than having neither. He talked about reading. He was a great reader himself, and he wanted his students to read widely and to read seriously. Not just the practical texts related to their trades and their studies, but literature, history, biography, the full range of what human beings had thought and written about human experience. Because a person who has only read narrowly is a person whose understanding of the world is narrow, and a person whose understanding of the world is narrow will keep being surprised by things that should not be surprising, will keep making mistakes that a broader education would have helped them avoid. He also talked about listening. He was a great listener, which surprised some people who also knew him as a great speaker. But he understood that listening was actually more important than speaking in most situations, because listening is how you learn what you do not already know, and what you do not already know is vastly larger than what you do know, and so listening is almost always more productive than speaking. He told his students about the habit of listening to people who know more than you, not just formally, in classrooms, but informally, in every situation. When you are in the presence of someone with experience and wisdom that you do not have, stop talking and start listening. Ask questions, not challenging questions, not questions designed to show your own intelligence, but genuine questions. questions that come from a real desire to understand something better than you currently do. He was very specific about the difference between the question asked to learn and the question asked to perform. He had seen students ask questions in class that were clearly designed to demonstrate their own knowledge rather than to gain new knowledge, and he found this both amusing and sad. Amusing because it was so transparent, and sad because it was such a waste of the very limited opportunities we have to actually learn something from someone who knows more than we do. He believed that one of the most important things he could give his students was the habit and the love of genuine inquiry, genuine curiosity, the habit of approaching the world with questions rather than conclusions, the ability to be genuinely uncertain about things rather than prematurely certain. This might seem like it would make people less confident, but Washington believed the opposite. He believed that genuine inquiry and genuine openness to being wrong produced, over time, a deeper and more reliable confidence than the false certainty that mistakes certainty for strength. There is a student who came to Tuskegee who had been, in his home community, considered the smartest boy around. He had gotten through his early schooling without much effort, had been praised by every teacher, had developed a strong and sometimes arrogant sense of his own intelligence. He arrived at Tuskegee somewhat expecting to be recognized immediately as exceptional. He was not recognized as exceptional. He was recognized as a student with strong potential who had significant gaps in his knowledge and who had not yet developed the habits of genuine study and genuine humility that deep learning requires. This was extremely uncomfortable for him. He resisted it. He argued. He pointed to his past performance as evidence that the current assessment was wrong. But he had a teacher at Tuskegee who was patient and who was honest with him. This teacher did not confirm his self-image, but neither did this teacher dismiss or diminish him. This teacher simply kept presenting him with questions he could not answer, problems he could not solve, and then working with him, patiently, carefully, to develop the understanding and the tools that would let him eventually answer and solve them. By the end of his time at Tuskegee, this student had been genuinely transformed. Not from smart to smarter, but from someone who thought of himself as a finished product to someone who understood himself as a work in progress. From someone who resisted difficulty to someone who sought it out because he had learned through direct experience. That difficulty was where the real growth happened. He left Tuskegee genuinely humble, genuinely curious, genuinely equipped for a life of continued learning. And he accomplished extraordinary things. That transformation, from confident but fragile to genuinely capable and genuinely humble, is precisely what Washington was trying to create over and over in student after student. Not to diminish them, but to build in them something more durable and more real than the fragile self-image that had arrived with them. Washington spoke about religion and faith in ways that were sometimes surprising for a figure of his public prominence. He did not use religion as a performance or as a credential. He talked about it as a genuine personal resource, as a source of the patience and the long view that his work required. He believed that a person's internal life, the quality of their relationship with their own deepest values and commitments, was the foundation from which everything external was built. And he talked about the importance of taking that internal life seriously, of not neglecting it in the rush of practical demands. He was not prescriptive about the forms of this. He did not insist on a particular theology or a particular practice, but he was very clear that the person who has no internal life, no relationship with something larger than their daily concerns, no connection to values and meanings that extend beyond the practical and the immediate, that person is building on sand. They will find, when things get hard, when loss comes or failure comes or the work becomes genuinely discouraging, that they have nothing to draw on. No reserves, no depth. He talked about the relationship between character and character under pressure. Any character looks good when things are going well. The test of genuine character is what happens when things go badly. When the money runs out, when the project fails, when the relationship breaks, when the health fails, when the thing you built falls down. What you do then, how you respond then, who you are in that moment, that is the real measure. And the resource you draw on in that moment is built in all the other moments, in the ordinary days, in the small choices, in the habits of thought and practice that you have been building or failing to build for years before the crisis arrived. Washington had a genuine crisis at Tuskegee. He does not dwell on it in these talks because that was not his style. But historians who have studied him know that there were moments when the institution seemed genuinely in danger of failing, when the resources were so scarce and the opposition so strong and the difficulties so multiplied that a less committed person would have concluded that it was time to stop. And what he drew on in those moments was exactly what he had been teaching: the long view, the patience, the faith in the value of the work, the habit of focusing on what could be done rather than on what could not, the deep reserves of purpose that came from knowing exactly why he was doing what he was doing. He got through those moments. Tuskegee survived and grew. And the survival and the growth were not separate from the character of the man who led it. They were expressions of it. Let us talk about one more thing that runs through character building like a thread, which is the concept of practical idealism. Washington was an idealist. He believed in things deeply and genuinely. He believed in human dignity and human potential and the possibility of genuine progress. But he was also, as deeply, a realist. He understood the world as it actually was, not as it should be. And his practical idealism was the combination of these two things. He held his ideals firmly while engaging relentlessly with the actual reality in front of him. He did not wait for better conditions to begin the work. He did not require perfection before he would commit fully. He took the world as it was, the imperfect resources, the hostile environment, the students who arrived with enormous needs and sometimes limited preparation, and he worked with all of it, genuinely and completely, in service of his vision of what was possible. This is, I think, one of the most important and most rarely achieved qualities in human life. Most of us are either idealistic in a way that becomes detached from reality, where we hold our vision so purely that we refuse to engage with the imperfect world that might actually make it real, or we are realistic in a way that becomes cynical, where we engage so completely with the limitations and the difficulties that we lose sight of the vision entirely and end up just managing problems rather than building something. Washington managed to hold both. He held the vision and the reality simultaneously, and he used each to strengthen the other. The reality kept the vision honest and practical and achievable. The vision kept the reality from becoming merely discouraging. He wanted this for his students. He wanted them to be clear about what they were trying to build, specific and committed about their vision for their own lives and their communities, while also being genuinely engaged with the real conditions of their actual lives. Not waiting for better conditions, not dismissing the conditions that existed, working with them, being clever and creative and persistent about what could be done within them. This is the work. This is always the work of living a good life, of building a character worth having, of contributing something real to the world, is always done under imperfect conditions, with incomplete resources, surrounded by difficulty and uncertainty. The question is never whether the conditions are ideal. They are not. They never will be. The question is what you do with what you have, right where you are, starting now. Washington's whole life was an answer to that question. A man born into slavery, with nothing, literally nothing, who built, through character and work and faith and patience and honesty and genuine service, one of the most important educational institutions in American history, and who left behind a body of wisdom that is as alive and as useful today as it was when he first spoke it to those students in Alabama 120 years ago. There is something that happens when you read the talks collected in character building, or listen to them, or simply spend time with the ideas in them. You feel quietly and persistently a kind of call, a call toward better, not toward perfect, because Washington was never interested in perfection as an abstract standard, but toward better habits, better honesty, better attention to the small things, better patience with the slow process, better generosity toward the people around you, better faith in the value of the work. He ends many of his talks not with grand declarations but with quiet, specific encouragements. Do this thing. Practice this habit. Pay attention to this. Take this seriously. He was not a man of dramatic gestures or grand rhetoric. He was a man of consistent, patient, practical engagement with the real work of building human beings who are capable of building something real in the world. And the message that comes through all of it, from the talk about cleanliness to the talk about faith, from the discussion of work to the discussion of honesty, from the advice about patience to the advice about community, is this. You are capable of more than you know. The life you are living is raw material. The character you have now is a starting point, not a verdict. And every single day, in the small choices and the large ones, in the visible moments and the invisible ones, you are building. The only question is what you are building, and that question has an answer, and the answer is yours to give. Washington looked out at those students in the chapel at Tuskegee, students who had come from poverty and hardship and circumstances that would have crushed many people entirely, and he saw in them what they could not yet see in themselves. He saw people who, given the right habits and the right faith and the right understanding of what genuine character actually is, were capable of extraordinary things. And most of them proved him right, not because he was naive about them, but because the expectation itself, the genuine, serious, sustained expectation that they would rise, was part of what made them rise. This is perhaps the final lesson of character building. It is not just a book about how individuals build their own character. It is a book about what happens when someone genuinely believes in the capacity of other people and expresses that belief not in empty encouragement, but in real expectation, real support, real engagement with their actual struggles and actual potential. Washington gave those students everything he had: his time, his attention, his honesty, his patience, his experience, his wisdom, his faith. He gave it continuously and without reservation, year after year, in talk after talk, in the way that he ran his institution and in the way that he lived his life. And what came back to him, what came back to Tuskegee into the world through those students and through the generations of students who came after them, was something incalculable. That is what character building is. That is what it produces, not just better individuals, though it does produce that. It produces the capacity to give something real to the world, to contribute something that matters. To be, when you stand in front of the people who depend on you or who look to you for something, actually worth the trust they are placing in you. You are right now, whatever you tell yourself about what has already been decided, in the middle of building something. Your character is not finished. It was not finished yesterday, and it will not be finished tomorrow. It is being built today, in the choices you are making, in the habits you are practicing, in the attention you are giving or not giving to the things that matter. Washington stood in front of his students and said, essentially this: you have the power to be more than circumstances have told you. You have the power to build something real. And the building begins here, now, with these small things, done well, done honestly, done with care, done consistently, not once, not dramatically, but every day, one day at a time. That is the whole of it. That is what he was saying. And more than a century later, it is still exactly what needs to be said. If this has meant something to you, if you have found something here that shifts something in how you are thinking about your own life and your own work and your own character, then please do two things. Tell someone about it, and then go do one thing, just one specific thing that puts what you have heard into practice. Because wisdom that stays only in the mind is not really wisdom yet. It becomes wisdom when it moves into action, into habit, into the actual texture of your daily life. That is what Washington wanted, not nodding agreement, not admiration from a distance. He wanted action. He wanted students who left those Sunday evening talks and did something differently the next morning. Something small, perhaps, but real. A room cleaned more carefully, a promise kept more faithfully, a piece of work done with more genuine attention, a fellow student encouraged honestly, a difficult truth told kindly, one brick placed in the wall, and then the next day, another brick, and the next day, another, until, looking back from some future vantage point, you can see that you have been building, steadily and truly, something that will stand. Booker T. Washington built something that stood. He built it out of nothing, under impossible conditions, in the face of extraordinary opposition, with faith and patience and honest hard work and genuine love for the human beings in his care. And he left us these talks, these real and practical and deeply human conversations about how to live, as a gift that has outlasted everything that was ever used against him. Read them. Listen to them. Let them work on you. Let the small truths accumulate, as small things do when you take them seriously, into something larger and more solid than any of them appeared alone. Thank you for spending this time with this material. If you have made it this far, you are the kind of person who takes ideas seriously, and the world needs more of that. Please like this video and subscribe to Audiobook Library if you have not already. It makes a genuine difference to whether this channel can keep creating this kind of content, and it helps other people who need this wisdom find it. Share it with someone you think could use it. Leave a comment telling us which idea from Washington's work hit you hardest, because those conversations are genuinely valuable and we read them. And please, do take some time to explore the other videos on this channel. We have built a library of audiobook summaries and long-form explorations of some of the most important books ever written about human character, human excellence, and human flourishing. Books that have been changing lives for generations and that, given the chance, might change yours. You can find them all on the Audiobook Library channel, and each one is crafted with the same care and attention and genuine love for ideas that you have experienced here today. Before we arrive at the closing thoughts, there is still so much more from Washington that deserves to be unpacked fully, because his talks and character building cover territory that we have only begun to explore, and the richness of what he said deserves more than a passing mention. So let us keep going, because the depth of what this man understood about human life is extraordinary. Washington gave a great deal of attention to the idea of self-respect, and he talked about it in ways that were deeply original for his time and remain deeply relevant for ours. He believed that self-respect was not something that came from outside you. It was not something that other people gave you or that circumstances granted you. It was something you either built or neglected, entirely through your own choices and your own behavior toward yourself and toward the world. He had seen young people who had been told, explicitly and implicitly, by the world around them that they were not worthy of respect, that their lives mattered less, that their potential was limited, that their future was constrained. And he had watched what happened to the ones who accepted this verdict, who took the world's low opinion of them and made it their own opinion of themselves. They became smaller, not because they were small, but because they were walking around carrying a story about themselves that did not fit them, a diminished self-image that was inconsistent with their actual capacity and their actual worth. And he had watched what happened to the ones who rejected this verdict, who looked at the world's low opinion of them and said quietly but firmly, "No, that is not who I am," and who then proved it, not with declarations but with action, day after day, by behaving like people who respected themselves, by doing their work with care, by keeping their promises, by speaking honestly, by presenting themselves with dignity, by refusing to shrink. He talked about the dignity of the body, about the way you carry yourself, not in the superficial sense of trying to look impressive, but in the genuine sense of inhabiting your own physical presence with confidence and care. He had noticed that people who had internalized shame, people who had been convinced at some deep level that they were somehow less than, often expressed this in their physical presence. In a kind of habitual shrinking, a tendency to take up less space than they were entitled to, a way of walking and standing and sitting that said, quietly and continuously, "I do not quite believe I belong here." He wanted his students to stand straight, not literally only, though literally too. He wanted them to inhabit their lives fully, to take up the space they were entitled to be present in the world with the full weight of their humanity and their dignity. This was not arrogance. This was the opposite of arrogance. Arrogance is the overcompensation of someone who secretly doubts their own worth. Genuine self-respect is the calm, grounded, secure presence of someone who does not need to prove anything because they already know who they are. Washington connected self-respect to the treatment of others in a way that was both simple and profound. He observed that the way you treat others is almost always a direct reflection of how you regard yourself. The person who is genuinely secure in their own worth does not need to diminish others to feel elevated. They do not need to compare and compete and jockey for position and make sure that everyone knows how excellent they are. They can simply be excellent and let that speak for itself, and be genuinely glad when others are excellent too. He saw envy as one of the most self-destructive emotions available to human beings, and he talked about it honestly. He had seen students fall into envy of each other, and he had noticed what it did to them. It consumed enormous amounts of energy that could have been going toward their own development. It made them smaller rather than larger, Because every moment spent resenting someone else's success was a moment not spent building your own. And it corroded the very relationships that were a crucial part of their education and their future. Because it is very difficult to learn from someone you envy, and very difficult to be helped by someone you secretly resent. He told his students that the most effective antidote to envy was not an effort of will to stop feeling it, because that rarely works, but a genuine redirection of attention toward your own work and your own growth. When you find yourself envying someone, he said, that is information. That is your own heart telling you about something you want, something you value, something you aspire to. Use it. Let it clarify what you are actually after, and then put your energy into going after it, rather than into resenting the person who already has it. This is psychologically sophisticated advice that anticipated ideas that would not become mainstream in the field of psychology for another half-century. The idea that emotions are information, not just problems to be suppressed. The idea that the energy in a difficult emotion like envy can be redirected toward constructive purposes rather than simply struggled against. These are ideas that feel very modern and very evidenced. Washington arrived at them through simple, careful observation of the human beings in his care. He talked at length about the relationship between knowledge and character, which is a relationship that philosophers have been wrestling with for millennia and which has no simple resolution. Washington's view on this was nuanced and experience-based. He did not believe that education automatically produced character. He had seen too many educated people of bad character to believe that. But he did believe that genuine education, the kind that engaged not just the intellect but the whole person, the kind that asked hard questions and required honest self-examination and developed not just knowledge but wisdom, that kind of education was one of the most powerful forces for character development that existed. The distinction he kept making was between information and formation. Information is facts, data, knowledge stored in the mind. Formation is what happens to a person, to their character, to their way of being in the world, as a result of genuine engagement with great ideas and great challenges and great human stories. You can have enormous amounts of information without any formation whatsoever. You can memorize every date in history, and every formula in mathematics, and every argument in philosophy, and remain entirely unchanged by it, entirely unformed by it, entirely the same person you were before you encountered it. Genuine education, in Washington's view, was formation. It changed how you saw the world. It expanded your capacity for empathy by introducing you to lives very different from your own. It developed your judgment by asking you to think through genuinely difficult questions with no easy answers. It built your patience by requiring sustained engagement with complex material. It cultivated your humility by constantly confronting you with the vastness of what you did not know. He wanted Tuskegee to be a place of genuine formation, not just efficient information transfer. He wanted students to leave not just knowing more but being more, and he was willing to accept that this took longer and required more than a conventional school might demand, because he believed the result was worth the investment. He spoke with great care about the particular challenge facing young people of his students' generation and background, which was the challenge of building identity in the aftermath of slavery. And while the specific historical context was unique to them, the general challenge he was describing is one that resonates for anyone who has had their identity defined by forces outside themselves, who has been told who they are by institutions and cultures and systems before they have had the chance to discover who they are for themselves. He was asking his students to do something genuinely difficult. He was asking them to construct their own identities actively and consciously, rather than accepting the identities that had been assigned to them, while at the same time remaining grounded in and proud of the actual history and the actual community from which they came. Not pretending that the history of slavery had not happened, not running from it, not being ashamed of it, but understanding it as part of a larger story that was still being written, a story in which they were the authors of the next chapters. He talked about the relationship between individual achievement and community responsibility in ways that feel urgent and contemporary. He never believed that individual success was sufficient in itself. He never celebrated a student's personal achievement as if it existed in isolation from the community that had produced that student and the community that student would return to. Every student who developed genuine competence and genuine character at Tuskegee was, in his mind, a resource that carried an obligation to bring something back, to contribute something real to the community that needed it. He was not asking for sacrifice. He was not saying that individuals owed their lives to some collective demand. He was saying something subtler and more motivating than that. He was saying that the people who find the deepest satisfaction in their work are almost always the people whose work is connected to something larger than themselves, connected to a need that genuinely matters, connected to people whose lives are actually improved by what they do. And that the person who has both genuine competence and genuine community connection, who has built their skills and their character in genuine service of something that matters, is the person who is living at the highest level of which human beings are capable. He talked about teaching as a calling, and while he was speaking literally about the teachers and the teachers in training at Tuskegee, he was also talking about something universal. He was talking about the responsibility that comes with any position of influence over another person's development. Parents have this responsibility. Managers have it. Mentors have it. Older siblings have it. Coaches and teachers and community leaders have it. Anyone who stands in a position where another person is looking to them for guidance and support and example carries this responsibility. And Washington believed it should be taken with complete seriousness. The most powerful teaching, he said, is not done through words. It is done through example. The teacher who tells students to be disciplined and is herself careless teaches carelessness. The teacher who tells students to be honest and is himself evasive teaches evasiveness. The teacher who tells students to take their work seriously and himself treats his preparation as an afterthought is teaching something that no amount of good advice can counteract. He believed that the people who shaped young people were the most important people in any community, more important than politicians or wealthy donors or famous achievers, because the shape of the next generation was built in the relationship between young people and the adults who took them seriously enough to invest genuine time and genuine care in their development. And the adults who did this well, who brought their genuine best selves to the encounter with young people who needed guidance and example and honest feedback, those adults were building something that would outlast everything else they ever did. He thought about legacy in this way. Not legacy as monuments or institutions or reputations, though he built all of those things. He thought about legacy as the character of the people you have influenced, and through them the character of the communities they built, and through those communities the character of the world they shaped. A teacher who genuinely forms one student of genuine character has changed something that will keep changing in widening circles for as long as that student lives and influences others, and those others influence others. He used to ask himself and sometimes ask his students, what do you want the world to look like in 50 years? Not the world as a whole, not geopolitics and economics and technology, but the human world, the world of human character and human community and human relationships. What kind of people do you want there to be? And then he would ask, what are you doing today to build toward that world? This is such a clarifying question. It is easy to have vague, good intentions about the future of humanity. It is much harder to draw the line, directly and honestly, between what you are doing today and the kind of future you claim to want. Washington drew that line constantly. He was always asking himself whether what he was actually doing was genuinely connected to what he actually wanted to build. And when the answer was no, he changed what he was doing. He talked about courage, not the dramatic courage of grand gestures and heroic moments, though he had personally needed and demonstrated that kind of courage more than once in his life. He talked about the ordinary courage that daily life actually requires, the courage to say what you think when it would be easier to say what others want to hear. The courage to do the difficult work when the easier path is available, the courage to tell someone a hard truth that they need to hear, gently and with care, but honestly. The courage to admit when you are wrong. The courage to change your mind when the evidence warrants it, even when changing your mind means acknowledging publicly that you were previously mistaken. He thought this last form of courage was particularly rare and particularly valuable, because the person who can genuinely change their mind in response to evidence, who can say clearly and without excessive self-flagellation, I was wrong about that, and here is why, and here is what I now believe, is a person whose beliefs can actually be trusted. Because the person who can never change their mind, whose positions never shift regardless of new information, is not a person of conviction. They are a person of rigidity. And rigidity is not strength. It is fear wearing the mask of strength. Genuine conviction, the kind worth having, is both stable and flexible. Stable in its deepest values, flexible in its specific beliefs and judgments. The person who holds honesty as a deep value will apply that value differently in different situations, will revise their specific beliefs about honest behavior as they encounter new situations and new evidence, but will never abandon the underlying value. That is what Washington meant by conviction, not the stubborn refusal to learn, but the steady commitment to what genuinely matters, combined with the willingness to keep learning about what that commitment actually requires. He spoke about success in ways that were carefully calibrated to the specific situation of his students, but which have much broader application. He was surrounded by young people who had often been told that they could not succeed, that the deck was stacked against them, that the system was designed for their failure. And some of this was simply true. The deck was stacked, the system was often hostile, the obstacles were real. But Washington had also noticed something else. He had noticed that the people who spent most of their energy focused on the obstacles, who organized their entire understanding of their situation around the reality of the opposition they faced, were rarely the people who found ways through or around or despite the obstacles. And the people who acknowledged the obstacles honestly but focused most of their energy on what could be done, on the actual opportunities that existed even within deeply unjust constraints, were the ones who managed to build something real. He was not asking people to deny that obstacles existed. He was asking them to make a strategic choice about where they put their primary attention and energy. And he was insisting that this choice had consequences, real and practical consequences, for what they were able to accomplish. He told his students about Frederick Douglass, who had been born into slavery and who had taught himself to read in secret, who had escaped to freedom and then become one of the most powerful voices for abolition in American history. Douglass was a figure Washington revered, and he held him up not just as an example of extraordinary achievement, but as an example of extraordinary strategic intelligence. Douglass had not spent his life primarily focused on what slavery had taken from him, devastating as that loss was. He had spent his life focused on what he could build with what he had, on how he could use the capabilities he had developed under impossible conditions to change the conditions themselves. Washington saw himself as part of that tradition. He had been born into slavery and had been denied everything that human beings are entitled to. And he had, without pretending that the injustice was not real or that the cost had not been enormous, built something that changed things. Not everything, not as much as needed to be changed, not as fast as justice demanded, but something real, something solid, something that was still standing and still producing results long after he was gone. He talked about the relationship between individual effort and systemic change, and he was careful here in ways that his critics often misunderstood and sometimes deliberately distorted. He was not saying that individual effort was sufficient to overcome systemic injustice. He was not saying that people who were being oppressed were responsible for their own oppression, or that character development was a substitute for structural change. He was saying something much more specific and much more practical. He was saying that the young people in front of him could not wait for the structural changes before they began building their own competence and their own character, because the structural changes might take a long time, and because the young people who arrived at adulthood with genuine competence and genuine character would be better equipped to contribute to those structural changes than the ones who had been waiting. This is a subtler and more sophisticated position than it is sometimes given credit for. It is not the position of someone who does not understand or does not care about structural injustice. It is the position of someone who is trying to figure out what specific individuals can actually do in a specific situation to build toward a better world, given the reality of where they actually are. The students at Tuskegee could not change the laws of Alabama in 1895. They could not immediately eliminate the violence and the disenfranchisement and the economic oppression that surrounded them. But they could develop genuine skills. They could build genuine character. They could create genuine value. And by doing those things, they were both building their own lives and building, brick by brick, the kind of community that would eventually have the power and the standing to demand and achieve the changes that justice required. History largely confirmed this. The generations educated at Tuskegee and institutions like it built the black middle class that provided the economic and intellectual foundation for the civil rights movement decades later. Washington's work and the work of the thousands of people his institution shaped was a necessary precondition for what came after. Not sufficient, not alone, but necessary. He had a conversation once, which he recounted in one of his talks, with a man who argued that all the effort Washington was putting into education was wasted as long as the fundamental political and legal inequalities remained in place. "Why teach someone carpentry," the man asked, "when they cannot get a fair wage for their work? Why teach someone literacy when the laws deny them the vote?" Washington listened carefully and then said something like this: "You may be right that the political and legal inequalities are the most important thing to change. But the people who will change them will need to be educated. They will need to be organized. They will need to be economically stable enough to sustain a long fight. And all of that requires exactly the kind of education and character development I am providing. I am not choosing between education and justice. I am building the people who will eventually demand and achieve justice." He was not always right. He made some choices and took some positions in the political debates of his time that historians have rightly questioned. He was a human being operating under enormous pressure and with imperfect information and in a context of extraordinary complexity. But his fundamental insight about the relationship between character development, education, and the long work of building a just society was sound and deep, and has continued to prove itself in the lives of the people his institution shaped. Let us come back to the personal, because Washington always came back to the personal. All of his thinking about history and society and community was ultimately grounded in the individual human beings standing in front of him, with their particular strengths and weaknesses and fears and hopes and habits and potential. He never lost sight of the individual. He talked about the experience of loneliness that genuine moral development sometimes requires. When you begin to take your character seriously, when you begin to insist on honesty even when it is costly, when you begin to do your work with genuine care even when everyone around you is cutting corners, you will sometimes find yourself alone. Not permanently alone, not without allies, but in the early stages, yes, sometimes alone. Because the people who are cutting corners will not always appreciate the implicit criticism of your refusal to cut corners. The people who are being dishonest will not always welcome the discomfort of your honesty. The people who are satisfied with less than their best will not always enjoy the reminder that more is possible. Washington told his students not to be deterred by this. He told them that the loneliness was temporary and the character was permanent. That the person who becomes genuinely trustworthy will eventually be surrounded by people who value trustworthiness. That the person who becomes genuinely excellent will eventually find themselves in the company of excellence. That like tends to find like over time. And the investments you make in your own character are investments in the quality of every relationship you will ever have. He also told them that the loneliness when it came was itself a kind of education. It was the experience of discovering that your values were genuinely yours, not just performances for the approval of others. Because if you only behave according to your values when others are watching and approving, they are not really your values. They are just your performance of someone else's values. But when you hold to them even when it costs you something, even when no one is praising you for it, even when the people around you think you are being unnecessarily difficult or naive or idealistic, that is when the values become truly yours. That is when they become character. He talked about joy. And I want to linger on this because it is something that gets lost in summaries of Washington's work, which tend to emphasize the seriousness and the discipline and the moral demands. And those are real and important, but they are not the whole picture. Washington was a man who loved his work, who found genuine delight in watching young people grow, who laughed readily and often, who took pleasure in the beauty of the campus he was building, and the food on his table, and the conversations of the evening, and the small evidence of progress that appeared every day if you were paying attention. He believed that joy, genuine joy, was not the reward you got after you had done the work. It was available inside the work, if you were present enough to find it. The carpenter who was fully engaged with the craft of making something beautiful from wood who is completely present with the grain of the wood and the feel of the tool and the emerging form of the thing being built, that carpenter has access to a kind of joy that is very difficult to describe, but that people who have experienced genuine absorption in meaningful work will recognize immediately. He wanted his students to find this. He wanted them to find the work that was genuinely theirs, the work that engaged their particular capacities and satisfied their particular deepest needs, and to bring themselves fully to it. Not just because this would make them more productive, though it would. Not just because this would make them more excellent, though it would. But because a life spent in genuine engagement with work you love and find meaningful is simply a better life, a richer and more satisfying life than a life spent going through motions. He talked about gratitude in the specific context of beauty, and this is something I find particularly moving. He had grown up with nothing, literally nothing. No beautiful things, no spaces designed for human flourishing, no experience of what careful human craft and loving attention could do to an environment. And then he had built something at Tuskegee that was genuinely beautiful, not grand or ostentatious, but cared for. Gardens that were tended with attention, buildings that were built with pride, spaces that were maintained with genuine respect for the human beings who would inhabit them. And he talked about this as a moral and educational act, not just an aesthetic one. He believed that people who live and work in beautiful, cared-for spaces develop a different relationship to the world than people who live and work in neglected, careless spaces. That the beauty itself teaches something, that the experience of having something lovely and taking care of it builds a certain quality of attention and a certain quality of appreciation that carries over into every other area of life. He planted trees, lots of trees. He planted them knowing he would not be the one who sat in their shade. He planted them for the students who would come after him, for the people he would never meet, as a gift to a future he would not live to see. And this, he told his students, is one of the most purely generous acts a human being can perform. To plant trees you will never sit under, to build things that will outlast you, to invest in a future that you are not going to be around to enjoy. This is what it means to truly believe in something larger than yourself. He used to walk the campus in the early morning, alone, before most of the students and staff were awake. He said he did this to think, but he also did it to remember, to look at what had been built, all of it, the buildings and the gardens and the workshops and the classrooms, and most of all the people walking through them, and to remember where it had started, to remember the absolute nothing from which it had come, so that no day would pass without genuine, specific, grounded gratitude for how much had been built. He taught his students gratitude not as a platitude but as a practice, not simply saying thank you, though that too, but the actual practice of noticing what is good in your life, specifically and regularly. Not pretending that difficulties do not exist, not performing positivity, but genuinely and honestly looking at your actual life and finding the things in it that are real gifts, things you did not earn and do not fully deserve and that exist for your benefit, and feeling the real thing that recognition produces, which is not just a warm feeling but a kind of humility and a kind of motivation. The person who is genuinely grateful for what they have is the person who is most likely to take good care of it, to build on it carefully, to use it well. He talked about the future with a specific kind of hope, not naive hope, not the hope that things will work out without effort or that justice will arrive without being built and fought for. But the hope that comes from having watched human beings grow, from having seen people who came to him with nothing and left with something real, from having built something with his own hands from genuine nothing. That hope was grounded in evidence. He had seen what people could do. He had seen what was possible. And that had given him a relationship to the future that was both realistic about the difficulty and genuinely confident about the possibility. He told his students, in one of the talks collected in this book, that the most important thing they could leave Tuskegee with was not any particular skill or any particular knowledge, as valuable as those were. The most important thing they could leave with was the habit of growth, the internal orientation that said, I am not yet what I am capable of becoming, and that is exciting, not discouraging. I have not yet done my best work, and that means the best work is still ahead of me. The world has not yet seen what I am capable of, and I am looking forward to showing it. He wanted them to leave as people who had fallen in love with their own potential, not in a narcissistic way, not in a self-absorbed way, but in the genuine, motivated, forward-leaning way of someone who has tasted what genuine effort and genuine growth actually feel like and wants more of it. That is the gift that this book, all these talks, all these conversations, offer to everyone who encounters them with genuine openness. Not just a set of useful ideas about how to live. The possibility of falling in love with your own potential. The possibility of seeing yourself not as a finished product but as something genuinely in progress, genuinely capable of growth, genuinely worth the investment of serious attention and serious effort. Booker T. Washington saw this in the students in front of him. He saw it through their rough edges and their incomplete preparation and their histories of deprivation and their fears and their tendencies to avoid the hard things. He saw the potential underneath all of it, and he took it seriously enough to tell them the truth about what it would take to develop it. That is the most loving thing you can do for another person. See their potential clearly and honestly and tell them the truth about what it takes to realize it, not what they want to hear. Not easy encouragement that feels good in the moment but produces nothing. The truth. This is what you are capable of. This is what it will require. This is what I believe you can do. Now go do it. There is more yet to say about what Washington understood, because the talks in character building cover dimensions of human experience that we have not yet fully explored, and each one of them carries the same quality of direct, experience, deeply practical wisdom that makes the whole collection so valuable. Let us not rush the ending, because the richness of what remains deserves its full due. Washington talked about the relationship between thought and action in ways that anticipated by decades ideas that would later become central to psychology and philosophy alike. He had observed in the hundreds of young people who passed through Tuskegee under his watch that the greatest obstacle to most people's development was not lack of information or lack of opportunity or even lack of natural ability. It was the gap between knowing what to do and actually doing it, the gap between intention and execution, the gap between who people wanted to be and who they actually were in the daily practice of their lives. He was fascinated by this gap and concerned by it, and he spent a great deal of his time thinking about how to close it. He noticed that telling people what they should do produced almost no lasting change in their behavior. The student who had been told 100 times to study more consistently did not study more consistently because they had been told one more time. The student who had been told repeatedly to be more honest with themselves did not suddenly become more honest because the point had been made again. Information about what should change did not reliably produce change. What produced change, he had discovered, was experience. Specifically, the experience of doing the right thing, even once, in conditions where it was difficult, and discovering that you could. The student who had been told to study consistently but then actually sat down, fought through the distraction and the difficulty, and studied for 2 hours, had done something the telling could never do. They had given themselves evidence, concrete, personal, irrefutable evidence that they were capable of doing the thing. And that evidence was worth more than any number of good intentions or pieces of excellent advice. He structured Tuskegee around this insight. The practical work was not supplementary to the education. The practical work was the education. The student who had actually built something with their hands, who had designed it and cut the materials and assembled it and seen it stand, had learned something that no lecture about construction principles could teach. They had learned that they could build, and that learning was in their hands and their body and their confidence, not just in their head. He talked about this as the difference between borrowed knowledge and owned knowledge. Borrowed knowledge is knowledge you have heard or read or been taught. It lives in your memory, but it has not yet been tested against reality. Owned knowledge is knowledge that has been confirmed by direct experience, tested in real conditions, validated by actual results. It lives not just in your memory, but in your competence, in your confidence, in your sense of what you are capable of. And owned knowledge, he believed, was incomparably more valuable than borrowed knowledge. Because owned knowledge goes with you into every new situation and informs every new challenge in a way that borrowed knowledge, however extensive, cannot. This is why he insisted that his students do the actual work, not supervised experiments in controlled conditions, but real work with real consequences. When Tuskegee students built a building, they were building an actual building that actual people would live or work in. When they grew food, they were growing food that would actually be eaten. When they made products, they were making things that would actually be used. The reality of the consequences matter to the quality of the learning, because when the consequences are real, attention sharpens. When it matters whether the building stands or falls, you are more careful than when it does not matter. And that additional care, that heightened attention, is itself a form of character development. He talked about what he called the spirit of thoroughness, which he considered one of the rarest and most valuable qualities a person could develop. Thoroughness is not perfectionism, which can be a form of avoidance, a way of never finishing anything because it never quite meets an impossibly high standard. Thoroughness is something different. It is the habit of actually completing what you start, of seeing things all the way through rather than leaving them most of the way done. It is the practice of closing loops, of finishing what you began, of not leaving things in a state of almost. He had noticed that many people were very good at beginning things. Starting is easy. Starting feels exciting and full of possibility. But finishing, completing, bringing things all the way to actual done, that requires a different and more disciplined kind of energy. It requires pushing through the middle, which is where the initial excitement has faded and the end is not yet in sight, and everything is harder and less glamorous than it seemed when you started. The middle is where most things die. The person who has cultivated thoroughness, who has the habit and the discipline to push through the middle and actually finish, is extraordinarily valuable. Not just to employers or to institutions, though that is certainly true. They are valuable to themselves, because the person who finishes things is building something in their record of experience that the person who starts many things and finishes few never builds. They are building the knowledge that they can be counted on by themselves, the knowledge that when they decide to do something, it will actually get done. That self-trust, the confidence that your own commitments to yourself are real, is one of the most powerful foundations of genuine character. He talked about the management of time in ways that feel extraordinarily contemporary. He observed that time is the one resource that is genuinely equally distributed. Everyone gets 24 hours in a day, rich and poor, educated and uneducated, the fortunate and the unfortunate. The difference between people's outcomes in life has less to do with how much time they have than with how they use it. And the way you use time is, in large part, a matter of character. He was particularly thoughtful about the time that is technically free, the time between the demands of work and sleep, the evenings and the early mornings and the spare hours. He had noticed that how people use this time was one of the most reliable indicators of who they would eventually become. The person who spent their free time in genuine self-development, in reading and thinking and practicing and building, was investing in a compound interest account that would pay dividends for decades. The person who spent all their free time in pure leisure was not doing something wrong exactly, but they were making a choice about their future that they might not fully appreciate at the time. He was not advocating for a joyless life of relentless self-improvement. He was a man who valued rest and beauty and pleasure and conversation and the full range of human experience. But he believed that the person who is intentional about their time, who has thought about what they are trying to build and structures at least some of their available time in service of that building, is at an enormous advantage over the person who simply lets time flow by and picks up whatever happens to be in front of them. He talked about the reading of biographies with particular enthusiasm, and this is something I want to highlight because it feels especially relevant. He believed that one of the most powerful forms of education available to anyone was the careful study of how real people who had actually done remarkable things, had actually done them. Not the mythologized version, not the cleaned-up inspirational version, but the real version, with all the failures and doubts and periods of discouragement and wrong turns intact. Because the real version was useful in a way the mythologized version was not. The mythologized version of a great life produces admiration. It makes you feel good about human possibility in a general way. But it is hard to learn anything practical from a story in which someone simply achieves greatness because of exceptional gifts or extraordinary fortune. The real version, the version that shows how someone who was often frightened and frequently uncertain and repeatedly wrong and sometimes genuinely close to giving up, actually kept going and actually built something extraordinary. That version is a manual. That version is directly usable. Washington told his students to study Douglass this way, to study Lincoln this way, to study the figures of history not as monuments but as people. To ask, what did they actually struggle with? When were they afraid? When did they doubt? What did they do in those moments? And to take from those questions genuinely applicable wisdom about how they themselves might proceed in moments of their own doubt and fear. He had done this throughout his own life. He had studied the people he admired not to worship them but to learn from them. And what he had learned over and over was that the qualities that made people great were qualities that could be developed. Not by everyone to the same degree. Talent is real and it is unevenly distributed. But the foundational qualities, the honesty and the persistence and the willingness to do hard work and the patience and the care for others, those were available to everyone. They just required choice and practice and time. He talked about what it meant to be a leader, and he was careful to distinguish between two kinds of leadership. The first kind is the leadership of position. Someone gives you a title or an office or an authority, and you become a leader by definition. This kind of leadership can be real and valuable, but it is entirely dependent on the external circumstance. Take away the title and the authority, and there is nothing there except the person, with whatever they have built in themselves. The second kind is the leadership of character. This is the person who influences others not because of any position they hold, but because of who they genuinely are, because they can be trusted, because their judgment is sound, because they care genuinely about the people around them, because they have a clarity of purpose and a steadiness under pressure that makes people naturally want to follow them. This kind of leadership is built entirely from the inside. It is not dependent on any external circumstance. It travels with you. It cannot be taken away except by your own choices. He wanted all of his students to become leaders in the second sense, not necessarily leaders of organizations or institutions, though many of them became exactly that. But leaders in their communities, in their families, in their workplaces, in any situation where their genuine character and genuine competence would cause others to look to them for guidance and example. He talked about the responsibility this created. When people look to you, when others model their behavior on yours, when your choices become, in some sense, a template for choices others will make, you are carrying a significant responsibility. And the person of genuine character does not take this lightly. They are aware of the example they are setting, not in a self-conscious or performative way, but in a genuine way, in the way that a person who knows they are being watched pays more careful attention to whether what they are doing is what they would want others to do. He believed that this awareness, the awareness that your choices have influence beyond your own life, was one of the most powerful motivators available for genuine character development. It is one thing to choose honesty because it is good for you. It is more motivating for many people to choose honesty because the people who depend on you need you to be honest, need the example of your honesty, need to know that it is possible to be a person who tells the truth even when it is hard. He ended many of his Sunday talks with a specific challenge, not a general encouragement to be better, but a specific, concrete, actionable challenge. This week he would say, do this one specific thing. Go back to your room tonight and write down one thing you are going to do differently starting tomorrow. Make it small. Make it specific. Make it something you will actually do. And then do it. And then next week, do it again, because by then it will be slightly easier. And the week after that, do it again, because by then it will be easier still. And eventually, you will find that you do not have to think about it anymore, that it has become part of how you do things, part of who you are, part of your character. That was his method. Small, specific, consistent. Not the grand resolution, but the quiet daily choice. Not the dramatic transformation, but the steady accumulation of better habits, better practices, better ways of being in the world. He had built himself this way. He had watched others build themselves this way. And he believed, completely and from extensive direct evidence, that this was how genuine character was built. Washington once said something like this in one of his talks, and I want to leave you with it. He said that the highest test of the civilization of any race is its willingness to extend a helping hand to the less fortunate. But before we arrive at the very end, there is one final strand of his thinking that is perhaps the most personal, and the most quietly powerful of everything he spoke about. It has to do with contentment and ambition, and how they can, if properly understood, live together inside the same person without contradiction. Most of us are taught to think of contentment and ambition as opposites. That the ambitious person is by definition not content, is always reaching, always wanting more, never satisfied with what they have. And that the content person has in some sense made peace with their limitations, has stopped striving, has accepted a ceiling. Washington found this framing deeply confused, and he said so with characteristic directness. He had known people who were ambitious in the surface sense and deeply unhappy in the deep sense. People who were always chasing the next achievement, the next recognition, the next accumulation, and who arrived at each milestone and discovered that the satisfaction they had expected was not there, or it was there only briefly before the next wanting replaced it. These people were not building lives. They were running on a treadmill, moving constantly, getting nowhere, in the sense that nowhere they arrived felt like a destination. The wanting itself was the problem, because it had no end and no bottom, and it had become its own motor, no longer in service of anything real. And he had known people who were deeply content and also fiercely engaged with their work, who found genuine satisfaction in what they were doing, and who were also constantly trying to do it better, who loved their present life and also cared about their future growth. These people, he had noticed, were the ones who were actually going somewhere, not running, but walking with genuine purpose, genuinely enjoying the journey, genuinely growing through it, genuinely building something real at every stage. The difference, he concluded, was the object of the ambition. The person who is ambitious for the accumulation of things or status or recognition will never be content, because these things do not fill the actual need, and so the wanting continues endlessly and unsatisfied. The person who is ambitious for mastery, for excellence in their work, for genuine service of something that matters, for the actual quality of the life they are living and the relationships they are building. This person can be content and ambitious at the same time, because the thing they are pursuing is something that grows richer the deeper you go into it, not poorer. There is no point at which you have been genuinely loving and must seek more love from somewhere else. There is no ceiling on how well you can know yourself, or how deeply you can serve your community, or how much genuine care you can bring to the relationships in your life. He wanted his students to learn the difference between these two kinds of wanting, to develop an ambition that was oriented toward the things that genuinely satisfy, things that grow deeper rather than thinner the more you pursue them, rather than the things that promise satisfaction and deliver only temporary relief before the wanting returns. This, finally, is the heart of everything Booker T. Washington was trying to teach in these talks. He was trying to give his students a compass, not a map, because no one can give you a map to a life that has not yet been lived. But a compass, an internal instrument that, if properly calibrated, would tell you at any moment whether you were moving towards something real or away from it, whether the choice in front of you was building something or eroding something, whether the path you were on was one that would eventually lead somewhere worth being. The compass, calibrated properly, points toward character, toward the slow, unglamorous, endlessly rewarding work of becoming the kind of person whose word means something, whose effort can be counted on, whose presence makes things better rather than worse, whose work is genuinely in service of something that matters. It points toward the small daily choices that no one sees and that build everything. It points toward honesty and patience and genuine care and the willingness to do the hard thing when the easy thing is available. Washington built his whole life by this compass. He did it under conditions that would have broken many people, against opposition that would have deterred most people, in service of a vision that required more patience than almost anyone could have sustained. And he left us these talks as his most personal gift, his most direct transmission of what he had learned, so that anyone who finds them can pick up the compass for themselves and start walking. That is what this book is. That is what it offers. Not answers to every question, not a recipe for a particular kind of success, but the compass, the internal orientation that, if taken seriously and practiced faithfully, will eventually bring you to a life you can be proud of, a life that is genuinely yours, built by your own choices and reflecting your own deepest values. Take it, use it, start today with one small thing done well with genuine care, and then do it again tomorrow, and the day after that. And keep going, through the hard parts and the discouraging parts and the parts where nothing seems to be working yet. Keep going. Because the harvest is real, the results are real, the person you are building is real. It just takes time, and the time passes anyway, so you might as well use it. Washington understood that the time passes anyway. He had been born with nothing and had built something extraordinary, not in a moment of inspiration, but in 20 years of daily, patient, persistent, honest, careful work. He had done it one brick at a time, one student at a time, one talk at a time, one small choice at a time. And the accumulation of all those small choices was a life that changed the world in ways we are still counting. You can do this. Not in the same way, not toward the same ends, not under the same conditions. Your life is your own, and the work of building it is yours alone to do. But the method is available to everyone who has ever heard these words. The compass is available. The truth that Washington discovered through 60 years of genuine, earnest, often difficult living is available. All you have to do is pick it up and start walking. That is Booker T. Washington's gift to you. Not a philosophy to admire from a distance, but a practice you begin today. Not a theory about what good people are, but a daily method for becoming one. Not a story about someone else's extraordinary life, but a direct and honest invitation to look at your own life and ask, with real seriousness, what am I building here? He stood in front of those students in Alabama, year after year, and he gave them everything he had. His time and his honesty and his patience and his experience and his unshakable belief that they were worth the effort. He gave it not because they had already proven themselves worthy, but because he believed they could. He saw, underneath every rough edge and every incomplete preparation and every fear and every habit formed in hardship, the person they were capable of becoming. And then he stepped back and let them become it. Not by removing the difficulty, not by making the path easy, but by teaching them how to walk it. You have been walking alongside that same teaching for a long while now. You have heard what he said about cleanliness and about work and about honesty and about patience and about community and about service and about faith and about joy and about the particular daily, unglamorous, absolutely essential practice of building your character. One small choice at a time, when no one is watching, when there is no applause, when the easier path is right there and you choose the harder one anyway, because you know somewhere inside you that the harder one is where the real person you are trying to become is being built. Take that with you. Let it work on you not just today, but tomorrow and the day after that. Let it be the voice at the back of your mind when a choice arrives that will test you. Let it be the standard you hold yourself to quietly and seriously in the private moments that no one else ever sees but that add up over a lifetime into something that everyone can see. Because the life you build in secret in those invisible daily choices is the life that eventually becomes visible to the world. The character you build when no one is watching is the character that shows up when everyone is watching. The person you are practicing being in the small things is the person you will be when the large things arrive. Washington knew this. He lived it. He proved it. And now he has handed it to you. If this has moved something in you today, if somewhere in these hours of listening a thought arrived that felt important or a truth landed that felt personal, please take a moment and like this video and subscribe to Audiobook Library. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who are looking for exactly this kind of wisdom, and it allows us to keep creating these long, careful, deeply considered explorations of the books that matter most. Every subscription means something real to us, and we are grateful for every one. And when you are ready for more, please come and explore the rest of our video library. We have built a collection of audiobook summaries drawn from some of the most important books ever written about how human beings can live well, think clearly, work with purpose, and build something worth leaving behind. Every video in that library was made with the same care and the same genuine love for ideas that you have experienced here. Go find them. They are waiting for you. And now, go. Build something worthy. Live something real. One small choice at a time, one day at a time, one honest effort at a time. Booker T. Washington, who built everything from nothing, who planted trees whose shade he would never sit in, who talked to young people on Sunday evenings about how to live and trusted that what he said would travel far and find the people who needed it most, would be glad to know that more than a century later, it still does.